Well, good morning and welcome to the first of a women's funeral professional conference put on by the WSFDA. Thanks you for everybody for being here. Not quite sure where everybody is right now. Hope they're not stuck on the pass or trying to get over, but I think some of them will be joining us through the live stream. My name is Anna. Last name Mallory. I am a licensed funeral director at Shaw & Sons Funeral Home in Yakima, and I also help out at Brookside Funeral Home in Moxie, and sometimes Charity lets me come here to Brookside and Ellensburg. Today we've got some great speakers lined up, and they're going to give us some tools and some skills that are going to help us advance in our careers, but also, most importantly, be able to help our families better, our communication with them, and our service to them. So first off right out of the gate, I think we have Jacob Bradley. He is a career public safety professional, and his experience extends around the globe. He served in the United States Coast Guard before pursuing a career in law enforcement and private protection industry. He currently serves in the private protection industry and leads 60 security, private investigative, and funeral escorts. Join me in welcoming Jacob.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay? I can hear you just fine. Are you guys able to hear me okay?
Yes.
Test 1, 2. You guys hear me okay? Okay, gotcha. Just making sure you can hear me. Sorry, to everybody that's there, thank you guys for having me. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but just like you guys are getting a snowstorm, Southeast Georgia is getting a massive wave of thunderstorms. We got hit last night with a thunderstorm. Flight got canceled. Even this morning, flight got canceled again because we're just getting hammered by some thunderstorms. But I'm glad I got to be here. Like she said, I'm not going to go too much more into my background. Other than I operate one of, I think, about 3 or 4 funeral escort services, as amongst other things, in the state of Washington. I'm a current sheriff's deputy. I've been in law enforcement for about 12 years, something that has always been a real passion of mine. And the funeral escort industry came into my life back in 2018. Some of you may have known Dave Beatty and Elite Motor Escorts. We ended up purchasing them in 2018 when Dave Beatty retired, and I just absorbed that into my existing security company, and that's where we're at today. The things I want to go over today particularly pertain to some rulings by the Attorney General regarding processions, really what a procession can do and what it can't do, and then what you can legally do with or without a procession. There are actually some pretty big factors going into it. And no matter if I'm teaching a police course, a presentation to the public like this, or anything, I've got a few objectives that I always have with my training. Number 1 is to keep you safe. Number 2 is to keep you out of jail. And number 3 is to keep you from getting sued. Every training, no matter who I'm teaching to, those are always my 3 objectives. So as we start to dive into these, we're going to go into, from our side, particularly the safety of processions and then the legalities of processions. We have noticed in the last year or so, there's been a uptick in the amount of escorts being requested, particularly for our company. We're averaging anywhere from 300 to 320 escorts a year. Every escort is different, but they average between 15 to 25 cars. So if you do the math on that, it's several thousand vehicles that are escorted from point A to point B throughout the state. So I just want to dive right into it. What can an escort do for you? And what can you do without an escort as a funeral director in the state of Washington? Well, number one, what the law says is if you are carrying remains in any capacity, um, you are entitled to offer to the family funeral escort services. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have a casket. We've escorted urns to their resting place where the family wanted to take them to a certain location and spread their ashes. That is perfectly allowed under the state law. Obviously, if you're going to the most common one, a funeral home to a cemetery, always entitled to escort services, no matter what the status of the remains is. So that's number one. Is we've had some confusion with, as some of you probably know, the cremations have kind of increased from what we've seen, and those families have felt kind of left out because there just wasn't an awareness that they actually do qualify for escort services. So we want to make sure that number one is in all funeral directors' minds, that anyone with remains is entitled to that same level of service, regardless of what they choose to do. And then the second thing is, what can an escort do for you? Regardless of the company, I can't speak for any of the other companies. I can only speak on what the law says. The law says if we're licensed and commissioned by the state patrol to do so, that we can stop, redirect traffic, disregard laws, do anything we need to do to make sure that the procession, our goal is to make sure that it's a fluid movement from point A to point B, as minimal interruptions as possible. And that's really our objective, is to give that family that extra level of respect and honor, that regardless of who their loved one was, that they get that honor on this particular day because it's the memorial for them. So we will stop traffic, redirect traffic, take control of intersections, do whatever we have to do in a safe manner to get you guys from point A to point B smoothly. Without an escort, and there's been a lot put out by the Attorney General recently on this, actually as recent as 2012, there was a directive put out from the Attorney General on these. And basically, in a nutshell, to keep it simple, if you are not using escorts or police, then you have to abide by all traffic laws. All traffic laws. You cannot deviate from the law in any way, shape, or form. Which legally means if you try to have a procession, that you have to ensure that those people following you, for instance, do not have their hazard lights on. That's a big one that we've seen. There's been a couple of crashes in King County where it was unescorted processions, and even though the directors said, hey, we're not a procession, you have to follow the laws, everyone turned their hazards on, which implied a procession, and someone tried to follow through a light, and there was a collision. So that's something that we want to avoid, is make sure that it is clear as day, no hazards on the vehicles, no deviation from normal traffic laws at all. And I would highly recommend, if they're even wanting to go to the cemetery as a group, that I highly recommend an escort service. It's just for our cost, I can't speak for other companies, but cost $150 per escort officer. We will do a minimum of 1 or 2 officers if the family is very financially stressed. We will just shorten that procession down, to about 4 or 5 cars. But even with 4 or 5 cars, if you have an escort officer, it protects you. It gives you a legal protection of, if something happens, whose fault is it? Because then you're lawfully operating a procession. Legally, without the escort or police, there is no procession. So be very careful about your wordage when you're kind of coaching the families about what they want to do. That is a big thing, is make sure it is clear as day. There is no going to the cemetery as a group. It is everyone's on their own. I would recommend you tell them that they can't even follow the hearse, because what we've seen is if they think they're following the hearse, they're going to think they have those privileges, and that's absolutely not something we want to see you guys get involved in. So moving into the safety, so kind of went over, who can have an escort, what an escort can do, and what you can do without an escort. I want to go into some rulings by the Attorney General. This one was there was one put out in '82 that was very, very influential in our industry, and there was one put out in 2012 that are very influential. And basically, it looks at the tort liability for funeral homes and directors should an incident happen. Now, should a escort be, let's say you hire escorts, and we're taking you through an intersection, and our officer is waving you through, and a vehicle comes through and crashes into the side of one of your procession cars. It's our worst case scenario, but let's just say it happens. The tort liability in that case is going to be on the driver of the vehicle and on the funeral escort service should all of our instructions have been followed. And what we mean by that is, before every single escort that we do, our officers come to whoever's driving the hearse, funeral director, and we give you a briefing. And we say, hey, this is what you do, this is what you don't do. And as long as you follow those instructions, you are protected on the tort side of things. The primary fault is going to be on the escort service, on us, on the escort officer. Were they following the law properly, giving proper instructions? And then also on the driver of the vehicle, depending on, again, what the situation was. But as long as you're following the officer's instructions, you are given that legal buffer of, hey, we were following a traffic officer's instructions and this happened. So you're going to relieve yourself of most of that tort. And by tort, for those of you not familiar with the legal world, we're talking about someone sues you after the fact. And they start to divvy out who's liable for what. You always want to minimize that. So in the end, if there's an injury or if there is some fault and there's a lawsuit, you're going to be protected if you have the escorts. Like I was saying earlier, we've had a couple of cases in King County, and I'm not going to go into the specifics of who those people were. I don't think that's beneficial, but the meat and potatoes of what happened was unescorted processions, did not have escorts, did not, told that they actually briefed the family before they left in both of these cases that it's not a procession, you need to follow all traffic laws. But in both cases, the family activated their hazard lights and began following the hearse. And in both of those incidences, it resulted in collisions from traffic infractions. Because they had their hazards activated and were operating in a procession style, this is what some of our directives from the Attorney General came out and said, is that legally was a procession, even though they were told it was not a procession, because once the procession started moving, just by having your hazards on, the motor vehicle code says you can't drive with your hazards on. Those are for when you stop and you want to indicate that there's a hazard. That's what your hazard lights are for. So by driving in a group with the hazards on, they were operating outside of the motor vehicle code, and therefore the Attorney General says that's a funeral procession, regardless of what was said. So in that case, the liability of who can get sued is going to be the person who violated the traffic offense, which is going to be the driver of the car that was involved in the crash, and then ultimately the funeral home, because the way the courts looked at it was the funeral home didn't stop the procession, so therefore they were complicit in it. And both of those funeral homes saw lawsuits from that. Take those exact same scenarios and add in a traffic control officer, and you're completely covered. You're safe. Because if they come after anybody, it's going to have to be a decision of, did you follow the traffic officer's instructions? And if you were, that's your only worry. Now, that's kind of the umbrella of the liability. But I want to go over a few things that we have started to do with the funeral homes that use us regularly. Is we are doing driver training. There is so much risk in doing processions if you do not have trained drivers. And I just want to go over a couple of incidents that we've had in recent history with our funeral hearse drivers. Hearse drivers are instrumental in the safety of them, because whatever the lead car does, every other car in the procession is going to do the exact same thing. So if they speed up, those cars are going to speed up. If you slow down, they're going to slow down. So all we would recommend is contacting a funeral escort service, whichever one you use. I have, no say on who's better or who's not. I can just only speak for my company about training. If you have a new director that's going to be driving a hearse in a escorted procession, I would say a minimum of an hour of introductory training as to what are your responsibilities, and what not to do. A couple of things that we see that I'll just go over pretty quickly is number one is what we call chasing the rabbit. Sometimes we have, because again, we hate to cut people off. So maybe we only get 3 escort officers for a procession that should have had 4 or 5 realistically. But because of money, they only ordered 3. So we have to, limit it to a certain number of cars. For us, that's about 20 to 24, depending on the route. So in that situation, there may be times where the officer at the procession has to take off and go take an intersection. What we call chasing the rabbit is the funeral hearse sees him speed up and decides to try and chase him. That is the biggest, most common mistake we see from hearse drivers. And that is, again, going into training. But you've got to make sure that those drivers know that if the escort officer takes him, he's taking off because he needs time to safely secure the next intersection. And that's not the time to follow him. Rule of thumb for us, and I would highly recommend you train your folks to it, is if that front escort officer has to leave and you don't have any escort officers directly in front of you, then we recommend and we train our directors, don't exceed 20 miles an hour for any reason until you get an officer in front of you, and then they start to lead you. Number one thing we see, and it makes a very, very unsafe condition, because now you're approaching an intersection that's not controlled. And what we'll see in conjunction with that is our second most common thing is the entering of an intersection before it's actually secure. What we see a lot of funeral directors do, they see the lights on the car, they see the officer outside blowing his whistle, and they assume this is secure. Absolutely not the case. If I get out of my car and I turn my back to you and I'm still trying to get the oncoming traffic to stop, and now you're coming in behind me, I still may not have secured that cross traffic. And we have had several close calls in the last 2 years, several, in that specific instance in larger intersections where the officer does not completely have control of the intersection. He hasn't given them the wave to come through. And then next thing you know, the procession is coming through and cars are splitting the procession. Most dangerous situation to possibly be in. And in that instance, the liability, again, would be shared. It would be between the funeral home and the escort company as to who's at fault. So that's why it's important. If it does not appear that the officer has complete and total control of the intersection, you got to stop. You have to come to a complete stop. We teach our officers to do it as quickly and effectively as you possibly can. But when you've only got 3 escort officers and a 20-car procession, you're going to be moving pretty quick to try and get those intersections secured. So again, just something that you want to train your person. Chase the rabbit. Use that phrase. I haven't copyrighted it. Don't chase the rabbit. And also slow down or stop. And you're looking. When you come into an intersection with escorts, if you've got an escort officer, your eye contact should be at the escort officer. You should be looking for them to give, because if once our training, I can't speak for the other companies, but once I've secured the intersection, I'm looking for my hearse driver. That's where I'm training my people to look. So we should be making eye contact with you. You'll get a thumbs up. You'll get waved through, something like that. Maybe a couple beeps on the whistle with a thumbs up. Sometimes we do that with our hearse drivers that we work with a lot of the times. We know that communication. But that's telling you that, hey, I've got this locked down. It's safe. Come on through, even if it's a red light. So those are the 2 common mistakes that we see. And then the only other thing that we really, errors that I think we see from the hearse drivers is the directional aspect. So with us, for instance, if we are going to have the procession turn, we are going to position our vehicles in a way that kind of gives you a heads up that, oh, his vehicle's positioned this way, we're going left, even if we don't necessarily direct you. The biggest thing, we've seen this a couple times in the last couple of months, is if we're not telling you to turn, if you approach another intersection, it's time to stop. If the light is green, it does not matter. If there's a stop sign, you have to come to a stop and you have to stay there until there's an escort officer. What we've seen happen is the hearse drivers are new, relatively new. They see a green light. They're naturally thinking, good to go. And they drive straight through a green light that has no control. Before an escort officer can get there, now the light turns red, and what does everybody in the procession think they can do? They think they can just follow through. That's where risk of collision happens. And if the escort officer is not in the intersection, even though you are being escorted, the 100% liability is going to fall on the funeral home. That is why it's so important. Even if you've got a green light, even if you've stopped at the stop sign, if the escort officer has not arrived and taken control of it, you have to stop and wait. And then in conjunction with that, if you go through a green light, we had this happen just a few weeks ago with a newer hearse driver. We needed to turn right at that light. She goes through that green light. Well, now we've missed our turn. And now we have to reroute a procession, which we can do, but it's, again, you're hindering the procession, you're making it unsafe. So those are the things you really need to sit down with the newer hearse drivers and explain the reasons why. Don't just explain this is what you have to do. Tell them this is why, because you're putting yourself and company at risk if we don't wait for those escort officers to take control of everything. And that's kind of just the ins and outs of what we like to see. A couple other notes that I wanted to touch on the safety aspect of processions. So we've seen, more in the King County area, Tacoma area, the downtown areas, we've seen a lot of funerals that need security. Now, I don't know about the other escort services, but we provide armed security, armed private investigative services. And we provide a lot of security for funeral homes. So when would you want security? I want to kind of touch on what we recommend. If there is anything to your knowledge that is gang related, we highly recommend hiring security. Now, there's several options that we offer. There's uniform security. We have also done many of our funerals in plain clothes or in suits where we have concealed weapons. Nobody really knows what we are. We're just kind of there looking for things that don't look right to us. But what you don't want to have happen, and again, 12 years in law enforcement, I've worked everything from narcotics to gangs. Trust me, it's sad to say, but funerals in particular present a very good opportunity for gangs to make statements to the other gangs. And we have actually seen a couple in South King where they have used them as a stage basically to make a statement. So don't ever hesitate to recommend to the family that, hey, we might want security for this, or we might want to hire the local police department if it's a smaller rural area. Maybe we want to hire an off-duty police officer to come and just be present. It's so much better, and I'll just say this: it's cheaper in the long run to have an officer there and be able to properly have a professional deal with those types of hostilities, whether it's a fight or a weapon or anything like that, than to have a funeral director trying to intervene and get injured or injure someone, even in the defense of someone at the procession or at the funeral. You injure someone, you injure someone. And if you're not trained to properly do what you're doing, in this case it would be security, if you're not trained and licensed to perform security, if you perform any security related duties and someone's injured, the full liability is going on the funeral home. So we want to avoid that. We want to recommend, and again, not just us, but any security provider that's licensed by the state and is legally allowed to provide armed security services. And again, we've seen differences from showing up at the viewing. Sometimes we've been present at the viewings. Sometimes we've been present from the viewing all the way till the end of the ceremony. It just depends on really what kind of threat you're dealing with. And that's kind of an interesting thing we've got too is how do you know what the risk is? That is where the private investigative services come in. You can absolutely, there is nothing shameful or disrespectful about finding some information about whoever, your family comes in with the situation of, hey, a murder, our son or daughter was killed by XY gang in a gang related incident. The second that anyone mentions gang related death to you, you need to be thinking in your head security or a private investigator, one or the other. Because if anything, even if we just do a risk assessment for you and maybe better equip you on what you might be dealing with, what's the harm at the end of the day when you've added a couple $100s to the expense versus a couple $1,000,000 of an incident happening where someone's injured on your property? I will say this too with court claims. I've been again in and out of court. I've been an expert witness. If you don't know about something, they can't hold you accountable for it. What they can hold you accountable for in a court of law is if you knew about something and you didn't do anything about it. And in these situations, one of the incidences was White Center, for instance, which is just south of Seattle. It's the unincorporated King County area around Burien. Funeral directors got word that it was gang related. They even got word that there was going to be an incident, and they chose to just put it in the family's hands. And an incident involving a firearm happened in the parking lot. Again, the courts are going to look at what did they know, what did they do about it, and was that action prudent under the circumstances? Again, that particular case is still pending in litigation, but you would rather avoid the litigation altogether. And number two, the safety aspect. If you don't have anyone in your funeral home who's law enforcement or security trained, it's just putting staff at risk in those incidents. So again, don't feel that it's a disrespect or you're somehow doing your family a disservice by saying, hey, we might want to bring in an officer, like maybe a security guard, maybe a private investigator, maybe a police officer. We're happy to dress them as you like. That's a big factor too. Some families, especially in some of these areas where they're not so fond on the police, they don't want a uniformed officer. That's where you turn around and say they can be dressed as however you want. But we do feel that it's probably prudent for the safety of our staff and the safety of your family and everyone who's going to be attending that you do hire some kind of security. And those are the big things that I want to promote to you guys is a funeral escort service, at least, again, speaking of us, and I know most of the other companies do the same. We're not just traffic control. We're not just the escort officers. We are there for the whole event. We want to make sure from start to finish, you guys are safe. It's a controlled atmosphere, and that ultimately the family is number one that day. From point A to point B, the family is all that matters. That's what we want to put forward. So whether that be, we've had instances where we put on white gloves and we carry a casket because it was, an incident involving a minor that was killed in a gang-related incident, and the family just could not conjure up the strength to carry the casket. They were very distraught. That's what escort officers are there for. If you have an issue like that, come, at least I'm speaking for us, and I think I speak for the other companies as well. That's what you're paying us for that. That's it. That's part of the escort. That is getting the remains from point A to point B. And if you have a family, we've done it several times where the family has just asked, could you guys do it for us? We will never, ever say no to that. And it's not an extra charge. So things like that, the security aspect, if we arrive and we're sitting out front, which we usually try to, we come in and check in and then we say, okay, we'll be outside if you need us. And you've got something that's making you uncomfortable. Hey, would you guys mind just coming and standing inside so people can see you? No problem. Absolutely no problem at all. So just think about that. There's there's more to the escort service than just they show up, get us from point A to point B, and leave. Especially when you're dealing with an incident where you think there might be a security risk. Trust me, we would rather stay the extra time. We would rather put forth the extra effort than to see something happen to one of our clients. And that's kind of, sums it up in a nutshell of what I wanted to present to you guys. Is number one, training for your hearse drivers, making sure that you know what you can and can't do, what you can and can't offer for funeral escort services. You can offer it to anyone with remains. And then again, the overall just factor of not only traffic but security for the venues and the personnel. Those are the big things that we want to make sure as we move into 2023, really start to push any funeral directors as we can possibly see, is that the escort services are here. We can operate anywhere in the state of Washington. And that's just kind of what we want to put forward, is that if you can absolutely give us a call and make sure that family has the opportunity, we will do our best to provide for it. And with that, if there's any questions that are in the room that they can pass on, I'd be happy to answer them. Other than that, thank you for your time, though. Okay.
So we are gonna give you an opportunity to ask some questions. Rob's gonna try and figure that out here pretty quick. I think he's bringing the computer around.
He's now on that. If you have any questions, you can either come up front and ask them or just shout really loud, and I'll watch the live stream to see if there's any questions there.
I can bring this to you.
We're at a funeral home in Spokane, and we lost our local escort service, so we haven't had any opportunity for that. Would we be able to hire you for Spokane?
The simple answer is yes, you could. The problem would be expense, is we would have to send officers over there from, the closest we have is probably going to be Black Diamond, Auburn, to the I-90 pass, Ellensburg. We have one officer in Ellensburg, but he's a retired police officer. So the answer is yes, we could. The simple cost would be up to you and the family. If they're willing to pay the officers to drive over, we would be happy to do it. But we can go anywhere in the state of Washington.
Anybody else? We also lost ours in Yakima. And do you have any there or close by there?
It's much closer than Spokane, but those officers would probably be driving over from the metro Seattle area. And again, we're happy to do it. It would just be the expense, and what the expenses would look like. I'll just put it out there. The officers themselves would just be the $150 per escort for the escort. We would just charge you the mileage for the vehicles, however many officers were coming. I would estimate that to be about somewhere between 50 each, so another 150. And then just for their commute, charge a flat rate for that, which would be anywhere from 30 to 35 an hour, depending on the day of the week or if it's a holiday. But minimum would be 30 an hour. So roughly, to go to Yakima for 3-officer escort, probably be looking at about $800 to $900, $1,000 on the top end. But if that's something that they're willing to pay for, I would love to send them over for you.
Anybody else?
I'm just curious if you have any information about what the law says if a funeral professional recommends security and the family declines. Are they then protected, or are they still liable for any type of incident that may occur?
Yeah, excellent question. So the way that court works is based on your action after the fact. So if probably gonna be assigned 50/50 if there's an incident.
That's very good information. I know in working in Yakima, we do have a lot of gang activity. And that protection is pretty important. Is there anybody else? Well, Jacob, thank you for joining us today. You've given us a lot of information that's going to be very helpful.
Absolutely. I wish I could have been there. I don't even think I'm going to be able to get there today the way the sky conditions are right now. But yeah, anytime. Even if it's, I will say this in closing. My plan, I love funeral escorts. I started doing them. I didn't intend to buy an escort company when I started. I was a tribal police officer at the time. I just wanted to do them because I loved the idea. I'm like, this is not only something I get paid for, but it's a service. Doing an escort when that family, you guys know, but for those of you that work with escorts, when you bring that family into that cemetery, we salute every family, so we're standing there, welcoming them into the cemetery. It's a great feeling. I love it. And if you ever have a question about escorts, or we're not going to charge you, I personally, for myself, if you send me an email or a text message or something and say, hey, we had a question, I'm not going to bill you to give you the answer to something like that. I love the funeral community. I think the job you guys do is just, I can't even describe the amount of commitment that you guys have. People say being a cop and getting shot at and chasing bad guys is a hard job. No. I would much rather go out and work downtown Tacoma or Yakima in a cop car than have to maintain my composure doing what you guys do, where you're constantly dealing with families that have lost loved ones. To me, that seems like a harder job to me. So I do give you guys the utmost respect. If there's anything we can help with, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm sure you guys have my email you can pass out. If you're a funeral director anywhere in the state, don't ever hesitate to reach out to me.
So is that the best way to get a hold of you is via your email?
It is. My email has a tab for directives, so I see emails and then I'm able to filter through them and organize them a lot better. We do have we're a multi-million-dollar security company now, so we do have quite a bit of business. And email just it allows me to prioritize and make sure that I don't forget about you. Whereas if you text or call, I'm relying on my memory. And not that I'm getting old or anything, but I do tend to forget every now and then. So email makes sure that I will always get a response back to you.
Well, thank you. We're going to share that email in just a little while, so you can all have that as a resource. Well, thank you again. We appreciate you taking the time, and I hope you have a safe trip back. I'm headed that direction tomorrow to North Carolina. So.
Okay. Yeah. It's definitely not snowing here, but
Yay.
this time of year, thunderstorms just come out of nowhere.
Yeah. Well, be safe. Thank you.